Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. We're very thrilled to have you all here today for our Research Spotlight series. Quite a lot of work goes into organising these, and we're thrilled with the number and quality of speakers that we get for these presentations and for the audiences who come along and invest their time and ask questions and reflect at the end and speak to our speakers. So we're thrilled to have you here. So my name's Sally Young. I'm the Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Arts. And today it's my pleasure to introduce you to a panel. Unfortunately, Professor Keith McVilly is unable to attend today, but instead a key member of the Disability, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative that's based in our faculty, Dr Paul Ramcharan, will be moderating the panel today. So thank you so much for stepping in. Paul is going to introduce the speakers and host the panel, and at the end I'll open up for questions and reflections. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you to for the Spotlight series for giving us this forum in which to speak. I just wanted to mention that the Faculty of Arts Disability, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative is based on the production of outcomes that lead to safe, socially just futures for people with disability, giving them access, inclusion, and where their diversity is valued. That it seeks to generate high-quality research across the faculty and also teaching and engagement around disability issues, and that it seeks to centre the voices of people with disability so that what we are driven by is knowledge that comes from experience. So we're not here just to theorise, we're here to listen as well, and part of today's discussion represents some of that, I believe. So what we're going to do today, under the theme disability, not an illness, not something to fix, is to start back really pretty much towards the beginning of my career. So the seminal works here were Goffman's Asylums, and Barton's Institutional Neurosis, in which the observations of institutionalization under the authority of the medical profession had led to some pretty horrific outcomes. And most theory after that was taken as a critique of that model, which took place at a particular time and also within a particular context in the West. So what we've got today is the opportunity to listen to people whose work implicitly critiques that, but also which comes from a number of diverse perspectives which are represented across the faculty. And the attempt here is to try to prompt people to recognise that whatever part of life you live in, experience, or whatever things you do, disability is going to feature, because it is part of the inclusive society. And so all of our work, whatever sphere, has implications for people with disability. So what I'm going to do without further ado is to ask the different speakers, and I'll introduce them one by one, a lovely, fantastic crowd. Orhan Karagoz will speak first, and I'll say a bit about Orhan shortly. Then we'll have Ethan Patrick, who is a third-year PhD candidate doing work on physical disability in current fantasy novels and movies. I'm so intrigued and excited about that one. And then finally, someone who I've known for a long time, Sue Olney, whose expertise in disability policy has been there for an extremely long period and has spoken and advocated out for a long time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give the floor for about 7 minutes to each of the speakers. Orhan was born and raised as a Turkish Australian in Melbourne, is visually impaired due to Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. And these are things that they've written in their bios, so I'm not dictating a medical term for Orhan. This is how he's described himself. He completed his PhD thesis in anthropology in 2021, and he's concerned with everyday relations and interactions, and I know that from speaking to him on several occasions when we meet on the corridors and in the lift and so forth, with the Turkish diaspora in Broadmeadows. Since 2013, he has worked at the University of Melbourne as a tutor in anthropology and is currently a postdoctoral fellow in anthropology. So Orhan, tell us a little bit about your research and work, but also on the basis of your critique of the medical model. Thank you. There we are.
Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks for introducing me. I suppose I briefly need to introduce myself. Well, I have done my undergrad at the University of Melbourne in arts, majoring in history and classics, and I have also done diploma in anthropology. Then I have done combined honours in history and anthropology, and then I have done my PhD in anthropology. Now, currently, I have also coordinated a couple of subjects in anthropology as well. Currently, as Paul has said, I'm doing my postdoc where I need to try to write one more journal article. So far, I have written 2 journal articles, and I'm at the moment trying to convert my PhD into a book, see how we go with that. I'm just still writing a response from a publisher. Now, being an anthropologist has really, when I became an anthropologist, it really made me think about how different cultures perceive disability. Every culture perceives disability differently. Like, we sometimes get into the trap of thinking that when we think of disability, we always think about how Western people think about, well, or how westernized countries think about disability. That's not really the case. Different cultures treat their disability or disabled people differently. And the perceptions of disability or being disabled do vary from world to world. And the definition of what is or what is not what is a disability or what disability is not something static. It can also change over time. Now, when I'm talking about disability and all that, when I think about it, people do definitely try to think about it from a medical term. How so? Like, particularly in my case, because I couldn't see people around me, I often did not know how to use my body. Like, I wasn't aware of my dictions, like the way I use my body. Now, as an anthropologist, I do know that people in their daily lives, we always reflect on how we use our bodies because we are cautious about how people may or may not judge us. By looking at other people, we reflect on how we use our body. Because I cannot do that, I wasn't like conforming to the traditional expectations of the society. When I talk about society, I'm talking about both the general society in Australia, which is dominated by the Anglo-Celtic culture, and with the Turkish culture as well. When you don't use your body in a particularly way that are expected by those cultural ways, people can treat you a bit strangely, or they could see you as something that needs to be fixed, or something is out of place. Now, I don't know if there's any anthropologists here, like, you kind of like feel a bit about like, has anyone here heard of Mary Douglas? Like, something is out of place that needs to be either thrown away or corrected. And that's sometimes how people might treat you. And that's the type of like mentality that I'm really against, because it's more in line with medical anthropology. They see something that needs to be cured or fixed. Whereas disability is not always like that. Even with your character, they may actually attribute your character to your disability as well. They would say, this guy doesn't watch what he says, like he speaks his mind freely, because he cannot see people's bodily language or facial features. Therefore, he doesn't watch what he says. He is always politically incorrect. And there's this pressure that we constantly need to regulate this person, how they speak or how they use their bodies. Like, sometimes, like, I used to, when I get excited or when I used to get anxious, I used to do things like this, or like, just like to do strange things like that. And people used to always tell me not to do that because it just looks a bit awkward or out of place. So constantly people did correct me to make me into a proper, when I'm going to say this in quotations, a proper social human being. But having said that, there are some differences with the Turkish community. Like, in the Broadmeadows Turkish community, which is highly influenced by Islamic values, when someone has a disability, it's also seen as a test by the God. The person who has a disability, I'm talking according to religion of Islam here, if you have a disability, Allah is supposed to test you. How do you cope with your disability if you rebel against Allah? And people around you are also being tested as well, according to the Islamic belief, that how they might treat a disabled person, or how they might be treated perceive a person with a disability, it's a form of test. Like disabled person is also given to a community to test the community if they are charitable, if they are supportive or not. Of course, I don't believe in that. I'm agnostic, but I just want to give you all as an example.
So that what I think we've just heard is really important, because what it says to us is that the definition, the theory, the understanding of disability is not necessarily fixed, that it can differ across cultures, and that our understanding of difference is also linked to our understanding of whether we accept others or not. And acceptance is at the very heart of diversity. So all right. Ethan, you're a third-year PhD student here at Melbourne, whose research focuses on representations of physical disability in current fantasy novels and their influence on societal attitudes towards disability. And you've mentioned your supervisors here as Eddie Patterson and Elizabeth McFarlane, and always willing to speak to people with an interest in this area as well as yourself. But you are also a writer, tutor, freelance editor by trade, and you've published a few pieces concerning the lived experience of people with disability. Most recently, an article entitled Disability Representations, which was published by the University of Sheffield's iHuman blog, which is really excellent. In fact, I think it's taken over from the University of Newcastle, which had its own material as well. So, you've snaffled a microphone already.
I know, I don't know how I ended up.
Yeah, you're ahead of the game. Look, the floor is yours, 7 minutes, and say a little bit as well about how your work differs from the medical model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that lovely introduction, and also for the point about keeping time, because I have no sense of time, which has nothing to do with my disability, it's just me. As Paul said, my name is Ethan. I'm a third-year PhD student looking at disability representations in novels. So I have a physical disability myself. I was born with cerebral palsy, which is a form of brain damage, which can affect either your whole body, parts of your body. It really depends on the person. And so the interesting thing about, so I suppose to start with my medical model beliefs and all that sort of thing, is to start with how I came into disability research. So I've been studying for the last sort of 10 years or so. I didn't find out that disability was a thing that you could study outside of medical models until about 2 years ago when I was in my master's. We did 1 week on disability theory in one of my subjects, and in that moment my entire life changed. I was like, nobody has ever told me this before. What I had always seen was that disability was really only discussed in a medical sense in terms of what treatments can we use to fix these people, what treatments can we use to make their lives better, what, all these technological advancements, and also in a social way look how these people are excelling, look how these things have changed, which is all very well and good in many ways. But when I was growing up with a disability, I was a very big reader, which probably is because I wasn't really big on sport, so for obvious reasons. So I read quite a lot, and I loved reading, and like most kids, I loved imagining myself in the adventures that these people were having and all this sort of thing. And when I was about 8, I just suddenly had this realisation, I don't know where it came from, where I went, I can't be a hero because none of the heroes in my stories look like me. And it wasn't meant to be, it wasn't that I didn't know I was disabled before that or anything like that. It was just I suddenly realised that nobody I was seeing in novels ever looked like me. And that really I didn't realise at the time, it really affected how I thought about myself and how I thought about my place in the world, because, while we may not have dragons and we may not have all that sort of thing that we see in fantasy novels, we do have what we call heroes, and we do have and we do have people that we look up to, and none of them appeared to look like me. In my view, and when I started to look around for people with disabilities in novels and movies and all that, and the things that I saw basically told me that the people around me, or the people that I interacted with, society, thought the same thing, that people with disabilities couldn't be heroes. They could be the best friend that inspires somebody to do something good. They could be the person that improves someone's life and then dies. Or that was they were sort of an off-screen character. They were never really thought about as someone who could have their own life and achieve things and do all that sort of thing. And that became a real big part of who I was. And the medical model sort of taught, I think, is where a lot of that comes from. People are taught that disability is this thing that we must fix, that we must make better. We must make them more like people that we expect in society. We must make them belong. We must make them less different. And while I can acknowledge that there are some benefits to treatments and things like that, I'm in no way saying that that's not the case. For a lot of us, our disabilities are not something that we need to fix. It's not something, they're something that are a part of us. And some of us can't fix our disabilities even if we wanted to. You can't take it away from who we are. So in my mind, that shows the disconnect between those things. And I see when I'm doing my research that the attitudes that I see in novels, so things like, again, disabled people not having romantic relationships and things like that, those are things that are still perpetuated in news. I think in the UK recently, or a couple of years ago, there was a lady who was turned away by a dating service because they didn't think people would want to date somebody in a wheelchair. And what they said that they wanted to be honest and set her expectations, because they didn't want to take her money and then, set her up with unrealistic expectations, and maybe she should wait until there was a dating service for people with disabilities. Which again just reflects this idea that we don't have the same value, that immediately disability is something less than, whereas that's not the case. And I think while novels are one facet of representation, I think at least I as a child picked up a lot of what I know about the world through reading. And I think we pick up those things when we read, kids pick them up, and so I think that's why representation is important, and those things are representative of each other. I think that sort of...
Thank you. That's a fantastic introduction. I think we're going to have lots of clay to mould with the questions that come a little bit later on. We had an interesting conversation earlier yesterday about veterans and the Greek city-state, I think, which started those things of people who are physically disabled in battle being very much revered and things of that nature as maybe an exception to some of the things you were talking about, which is interesting as well. And perhaps is something on the narrative in the US election at the moment. What isn't, I ask myself. That having been said, we're now going to listen to Associate Professor Sue Olney. Now, there are certain people you go through life, and when you get into different sort of settings in policy and, community sector organisations and things like that, people always, there are people who come up with the name and they say, "Oh, have you talked to Sue Olney?" And her name just keeps on cropping up everywhere. And I think it talks a great deal about the reach that Sue has, but also about the extreme impact that her work has had over many, many years. So Sue is the University of Melbourne BSL, Brother of St Lawrence Principal Research Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences, part of the Faculty of Arts. And has worked in universities, government, and across the interdisciplinary research projects as well. A lot of them focused on access and equity, but in particular work, education and training for people with disability, both here, but also internationally also. So there's a comparative perspective there too. Sue is on the editorial board of the Australian Journal of Public Administration. Note to anybody who's... No, I'm only joking. Due to submit an article. But is also author of... is director of the platform Power to Persuade. So again, another thing that's linked to advocacy. And I think it's really important to note that in the disability sphere, advocacy as a sort of fulcrum for social change agentry is exceptionally important and goes hand in hand with a lot of our academic and other work. So, Sue, the floor is yours for 7 minutes, and tell us a bit about why the medical model was wrong, but also about your work and research. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Sometimes I think it's just having been around for a long time that I feel like I'm involved in lots of discussions. But over my working life, I've definitely seen the discussion and the discourse around disability shift. And that has been driven by people with disability, working very hard in that space. So I'm going to start with some numbers. I am a public policy scholar. And historically, my work has looked at the impact of reform of public services on marginalised people and communities. And over the course of my working life, I've seen disability permeate every aspect of policy in that area. Many of the issues that we face around social policy in particular now are where we're finding growing numbers of people with disability demanding access to the services to which they are entitled as citizens of this country. So I'm going to start with some numbers. You would know, I think, that around 20% of Australians have a disability, and about 12% of our working age population have a disability. We are still designing public services that treat 20% of our population as outliers. And that has consequences for the cost of services outside that are deemed to be disability specific. In terms of our human capital, our working age population, we're continuing to design jobs that don't work for 12% of our available workforce. And those things are what really interest me from a policy perspective. Obviously, for the last 10 years, I've been very immersed in reforms of disability services and supports, particularly the creation of the NDIS. And the NDIS was built on the premise that people with disability should be included in every aspect of Australian life. And then the NDIS is the bridge that's needed between them having access to all of the opportunities and activities and services that other Australians have and whatever they need to bridge the gap to that. What we've seen instead is that all the available support for people with disability disappeared around the NDIS, and fewer people actually had access to support through that. And so we found ourselves in a situation very rapidly where the fault lines that are evident in every aspect of policy failure, age, gender, location, disability, socioeconomic status, have just cracked as fault lines in the NDIS. Scholars of public policy understand this completely, and they were flagging it long before the NDIS was enacted. There's no satisfaction, let me tell you, in writing endless submissions that say, "We told you so." On the employment front, I think it's interesting to note now that there are as many people with disability on JobSeeker, which is our standard unemployment benefit, as there are in DES, Disability Employment Services. And one of the reasons for that is welfare reform, which has pushed people who wouldn't historically have been in our labour force into the ranks of our long-term unemployed. And what we're seeing now is that the people who are long-term unemployed in Australia are older, they have a disability, they have a chronic illness. 70% of long-term job seekers only have partial capacity to work. And I want you to bear that in mind every time you hear people talking about dole bludgers and people who shirk work. I think we need to really reconceptualise what it means to be an Australian, given the number of people that we have in this country with disability. And for me, the intersection constantly in my work is that policy rhetoric talks about the social model of disability, but the way we ration public resources is a medical model. So, we say to people, you can have access to this support, but you need a doctor's certificate, you need a diagnosis, and so that for me is the policy tension that has been constant, particularly in the last 10 years. I'm not sure how the time went with that, but I'm going to pause there.
No, fantastic introduction. I mean, if we can give a round of applause to all our speakers. And I think the final points are really moot and very important indeed, and that is that social policies themselves have many assumptions built into them, whether they take place here or in other countries. And the majority of the world, excluding those perhaps where there are wars going on, have around 18 to 19% of people who have physical and other disabilities in their populations. And the NDIS itself, just like every other social policy in the West, makes people effectively state that they have a disability in order to access the funding, which is, again, one of the fundamental definitions of a welfarist model, in which that statement, I am disabled, allows them access to something else.
But firstly, let me extend my thanks to the panellists. That was a really powerful articulation of the major issues. And you covered across culture, representation and policy, huge issues for our faculty, and very much appreciate you extending such insights to us today.